Holy shit, it's at 35 amps. Oh, it's on fire. Yeah, I can smell it.
Jesus Christ, 200 Celsius.
Holy shit. That's not supposed to be like that.
There's also a level of possible fuckery here that you should be aware of.
These CPUs self-destructed. Literally, they internally combusted to such a degree that the inside of them blasted outward. When we conducted internal failure analysis, we saw scorch marks in the same spot on 3 dead CPUs, the center of the I/O die and the edge of the CCD, and that immediately pointed us to the root cause. Also, we saw fractured silicon. Although AMD released a statement about lowering SoC voltage, we still need to understand exactly what happened. These companies bottle up details forever when they find the actual root cause, and in our testing, there's more to it than simply the SoC voltage at the surface level. It's not just death over time then from VSoC. We found improper fail-safe protections on ASUS and useless OCP on ASUS. We also found bugs on therm trips between a couple of boards. We found a BIOS so buggy with Gigabyte that it can kill chips accidentally.
Now that's interesting.
Wow, okay. What the hell? Something's wrong. Yeah, maybe their SoC knob is broken. And we found borderline adversarial communication between AMD and its partners, which is a different issue entirely. We're sending one of these out to the same failure analysis lab that worked on the NVIDIA 12-volt high power cables for us, but that content will be in a few weeks. Today, though, we soldered leads to rails that we suspected were running voltage too high. We employed thermography to prove that, yes, explosions are hot. We used an external voltage controller to read the VRM configuration and ran testing on the BIOS revisions that ASUS silently snapped out of existence. Oh, and we also killed 2 of our 7800 X3Ds and 2 motherboards. So it's been expensive, but it's in the name of science. This video is brought to you by us and our special limited edition 15-year anniversary GN foil shirt on store.gamersnexus.net. I started the Gamers Nexus website in May of 2008, and within the next few months of 2023, we're going to hit 2 million subscribers. To commemorate this, we're launching this shirt on pre-sale right now. It features a vibrant, brilliant blue component diagram GN logo, complete with PCIe slots, GPUs, fans, and more modeled in. We also used a gold foil 15 integrated with this special variation of the GN logo. The back of the shirt uses gold foil to show our trend line from when we were only a website until today. There will be a total of 5 special GN15 items launching over the course of the next year or so to commemorate 15 years in operation, all of which are limited and collectible within their different categories. This shirt directly funds massive testing efforts like this video and helps us to continue investing money and time into public service testing and analysis. And you get something unique, shiny, and brilliant, just like exploding CPUs. Back order one on store.gamersnexus.net today. All this started going down right as we arrived at AMD's headquarters for a totally unrelated video, so that was convenient for us. And AMD was in the middle of its scramble trying to diagnose it, so they were just as fresh working on this as us. Maybe a little bit of lead time, but this is all a very new issue. So as soon as we got back, I set forth to working on some specific aspects of diagnosis and asked Patrick on our team to assist me tackling the rest. And here's a quick recap of what's going on. Although there's evidence of this happening prior, the biggest post was on April 20th of 2023 when user SpeedRookie posted this harrowing set of images on Reddit showing a CPU and a motherboard. We reached out to the user and requested the fastest shipping under $500, and then we paid the user for their board, their CPU, and the shipping. And this arrangement, by the way, we are always open to if you have some kind of catastrophic failure of a part. It allows you to skip the RMA process. It allows us to research it and have a public demonstration of what happened rather than the company going, oopsie, here's a new one. Let's find a rug to put that under. And it moves you along quickly. So this allowed SpeedRookie to move forward and we got our content. A trend of other users, with ASUS boards especially and dead CPUs, popped up on Reddit. But since then, other users have posted in a mega thread about similar issues, including one from user SkyfishJY. This one was of a Gigabyte board and a 7800 X3D as well. The user didn't apply Expo and used only factory settings. In the photos, the user's board looked okay, but the CPU was clearly bulged once again. We bought these components from Skyfish as well and got the expedited shipping so we could add it to this video. So this setup behind me is what we use for testing. We have 2 camera setup plus a thermal camera. We added a camera this time from the 12-volt high power stuff because last time we were like, wow, that footage is some good meme material for ever. It's currently at 258 degrees.
I think we see the smoke, Steve.
You see the smoke? There's no cause for panic immediately. So if you have an X3D CPU, even if you have it in an ASUS board, you don't need to freak out right now. We do have some steps at the end of the video. We're gonna explain why it's all happening, but this isn't so widespread that everyone's CPU is going to fail. Just like the 12-volt high power stuff, there tends to be a lot of chaos and panic as soon as the first couple of these get posted, and you don't need to panic completely. Only some of you will have this happen. Does that help? But we think most of these are related to an SoC voltage that's too high, causing a slow death of the CPU. This is something that's known at this point and well documented. Future Steve here, however, we also discovered that ASUS has a major fuck up on its overcurrent protection, where its super fancy $700 ultra premium motherboards are designed in such a way that there are insufficient protection mechanisms where overcurrent protection allows for the CPU to be fast cooked from underneath after the CPU is separately slow cooked from within. So it's a combination of failures here, but the catastrophic part of this is one that ASUS can completely avoid, which we're gonna talk about a little bit later. It's possible this happens on motherboards outside of ASUS too. We can't possibly test them all, but ASUS was the easy one to figure out. And it took 4 days of nonstop testing, so. Let's start with filtering what we know and some plans. So first, as we entered this testing, we kept an open mind to the variables presented by motherboard vendors, AMD, BIOS versions, and users alike. We noticed some of the failed parts online didn't exhibit the same mutual destruction between the board and the CPU. That indicated to us that there are actually 2 problems rolled into one. One is the CPU is dying. And the other is that some motherboards then proceed to self-immolate and barbecue the CPU even further because a protection mechanism probably failed. That's not good. So if we clear CMOS...
You killed it the wrong way.
Based on the data we're presenting today then, we believe this to be 1 part AMD's fault and 1 part board vendor's fault. We're gonna get into the hypothesis and some of the physical inspection first. Again, we have a separate video. It's coming out in a few weeks. This stuff, it's not quick to do. We're trying to move as fast as we can because the internet moves fast. And this particular failure analysis we're doing separately is going to require external lab investigation, and that's gonna take some time. But for the first part, here's our hypothesis. We have 3 sets of components we're working on. We have a dead CPU and a catastrophically failed motherboard from SpeedRookie. We have a dead CPU and actually a still fully functional Gigabyte board from Skyfish. That one failed properly. And we have a was working but died for the cause GN CPU, and the motherboard still works. Actually make that 4 sets of parts, not 3. While filming this video, we decided one more try and YOLO'd another $650 on a 7800 X3D, another $700 on a motherboard, and we managed to kill $1,300 worth of parts. And that is all the more reason you should go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of these shirts, because it would help us out with funding these types of videos. We also have a promo where if you spend $65 or more, you get an additional discount, and that's at the top of the store page at store.gamersnexus.net. Using the full CPU pinout and schematic from a friend of ours, it's a lengthy document, we were able to use these images of the pinout to figure out what we care about on these CPUs. At this point, Patrick and I split them up and we started doing some resistance checking. We found low resistance shorts on the CPU that failed catastrophically and torched the motherboard. But we found 0 ohm complete shorts for the CPU we killed, which we'll talk about later, and the second CPU from our viewer Skyfish. In both instances of 0 ohm shorts, the motherboard was still working. In the instance of the low resistance short, however, the motherboard incinerated itself to the point of melting the socket. SpeedRookie's system was that one, and it was still on after the failure because power good was still asserted. That implies that either ASUS has OCP that's too high, such as on loop 2, or the chip burned in a way that the low resistance kept it being fed current. If the CPU is destroyed in such a way that the motherboard shuts down, obeying OCP and OTP, then the silicon will be damaged irreparably, but the motherboard will survive. Low resistance shorts can break OCP and other protections, which may allow for the motherboard to remain on and shoving current into a dead chip. In such an instance, and especially if a motherboard vendor like ASUS configured Loop 2 OCP to be too high, to where it's ineffective, this system ends up in a state where the board continually attempts to power up a dead CPU, sort of like a boot loop, with improper or blown apart protection mechanisms. An additional form of catastrophic failure could be the indium melting and shorting the SMDs on the CPU. In conversations with experts in the industry, many of whom we can't name, we received confirmation that a low resistance short like this could lead to a catastrophic motherboard failure. However, in our final hours of attempting to reproduce the motherboard incinerating itself problem, we made a new discovery that threw a wrench into the gears, and that discovery was an additional failure path. In the final test, we ran the 7800 X3D in the ASUS Hero with full cooling. We ran a Prime 95 small FFT heat load and monitored the thermals. Now, it's well known at this point that a high VSO set point of, say, 1.35 volts, especially if it actualizes as 1.4 volts, which is what was happening, that will slowly degrade a CPU, and it could eventually lead to this failure that we saw. It's a time bomb on an extended scale. Maybe never if you have a really good piece of silicon. But worse lottery pulls on chips will yield failures faster, so it's just an aging problem. We chose a VSOC set point of 1.45 volts, which is actually within 50 millivolts of what some motherboard vendors were originally running anyway. Now, this is high, but the point of this is a rapid simulation of aging and silicon degradation of an equivalent, let's say 1.35 volt set point, which was the original ASUS set point we'll talk about later, over maybe 6 months of use. In any event, even with a 50 millivolt higher than board vendor set point VSOC, the result shouldn't be fire. It should be some kind of protection. They're supposed to be in place. We observed as our clamped VSOC pads that we soldered to climbed slowly from a combination of leakage, heat load, and a screwy ASUS VRM configuration to actually 1.5 volt SoC despite a much lower set point. This is insane, and it's what'll happen from prolonged exposure to excessive ODM voltages. Eventually, without ever hitting TJ Maxx and therm tripping in the OS, we were still under temperature control here, overcurrent protection kicked in instead, and the system partially shut down to a 00 BIOS code. This is normal. We observed that the fans weren't spinning in this state, which made us wonder if that's leading to a thermal failure from very slow cooking, say overnight. Fortunately, this was not the case, as Wendell noted in our simultaneous testing call.
If you've got a board that's on, but you're getting 00, but the SoC voltage is on, then it probably could sit in that state forever.
But we allowed the system to run in the 00 state for a while, and we even removed the cooler completely. It's not like it was on anyway. The CPU IHS never breached 38 degrees Celsius in thermal imaging with an RSE 600, so this alone doesn't cause the failure, but it's related to one. AMD's external mechanism for throttling the CPU is proc hot, usually asserted by the VRM, which would allow it to avoid an over-temperature protection shutdown. But something didn't work here. So we flipped the power supply off, then we flipped the switch off, we remounted the cooler, and we turned the system on. Instantaneously, we were met with this. That's it. We did it.
We desoldered it.
We desoldered the CPU in the socket. Here's what happened. The part is obviously shorted out or very close to it in this state. So what should have happened after the first OCP kicked in and shut us down is ASUS's OCP should have taken over on that next boot and prohibited the scenario we ended up in. We reached out to an electrical engineer embedded deeply with this issue, can't name, and we asked for some additional assistance in explaining it. And they put it in simple terms. The engineer said, yeah, that's ASUS's OCP f***ing up. So everyone can understand that. When you turn on the power supply and attempt to boot it like we did, the system immediately knows there's a short, and it should cut the power at that point. ASUS even has an extra embedded controller on these high-end boards, and that controller could be leveraged for additional fail-safes in really cool ways to prevent any of this from happening. Unfortunately, laziness prevented ASUS from taking advantage of its own advertising and marketing gimmick, which is the controller. It could be not a gimmick. From the board's perspective, a 00 code means that the power good signal has not yet been asserted. So the CPU should be holding itself in reset until the power stabilizes. 00 is basically the same as no CPU present at all. Once the power good signal is asserted, it'll start the process and exit 00. 00 is essentially holding the board in a cold reset. You can see the system shoving current into the CPU even though it's clearly already shorted, and it can only lead to the socket melting. We watched as the current clamp climbed to 37 amps on the EPS 12 volt cables, or about 440 watts. The VRM can take it, so that means that OTP in the MOSFETs won't kick in. And we were running without a VRM heatsink anyway, so we actually put it in the best possible position to shut itself down safely. A real user would be at more risk here than we were. We pulled the cooler when we started seeing smoke, and the thermal camera revealed that the CPU was at 200 degrees Celsius. Insanely, we noticed that the substrate of the CPU was hotter than the IHS itself. This, in combination with the crack we heard, indicates to us that the CPU literally desoldered itself and sunk all the heat into the substrate instead of the IHS, but it was already long dead at this point. And because ASUS has an unreasonably high OCP for these CPUs really in general, the end result is that the CPU continues to get force-fed current that it eventually can't handle. And that's in a 00 state, no cooling potentially. This is pretty damning, and changing the VSOC isn't enough here. That's the lazy approach. It's a catch-all, but there's more that could be done. And ASUS and AMD both need to take action. If we were ASUS, here's how we'd look at this scenario, this bad scenario. 37 amps in this test at say 80+% efficiency puts us at 400 watts at least for being force-fed into the CPU. And this is for a non-overclockable CPU that was not overclocked with a nominal TDP of say 120 watts, maybe 170 watts if you're running something high-end. So the OCP here is way overrated for what's actually in the socket, and that's bad. The fact that it was at 400 watts at least and power good was still not asserted indicates to us minimally that ASUS's fancy premium controller and its fancy premium motherboard should at least be detecting, let's say, the CPU is on for 5 seconds, or attempting to be on, and it's receiving excessive current. Maybe we should do something about that and shut the system down. The controller has these capabilities. They could also reconfigure OCP to be lower. And again, these aren't overclockable chips anyway. And for the overclockers and for XOC, you can always manually bypass that. So it's not taking away any of the levers that we have. It's just enforcing stricter ones for more likely stock scenarios. And ASUS isn't alone here. AMD has a lot it can improve as well, besides just the communication, which AMD's kind of always struggled with.
What's up, gamers?
And we haven't even gotten to Gigabyte yet. That's in a few minutes. This particular issue should have never made it out of ASUS. And it's up to AMD, the makers of the CPU and the chipset, the ones who have the actual knowledge of what it can tolerate safely, to enforce and police its partners in a way that at least makes them follow these basic guidelines. You don't want too much enforcement and too many restrictions on the partners because it restrains creativity and it stops the motherboard market from being as diverse and interesting as it is, and it could have knock-on bad effects for enthusiast things like overclocking. But in the very least, something like this is not unreasonable for AMD to add to its list of, hey, we should make sure the CPUs don't melt themselves in the socket because the motherboard vendor maybe did something stupid. It's up to AMD to tell ASUS that it is, in fact, an issue that could escalate to a safety issue. Now, it's extremely unlikely, but just to maybe scare some of these vendors into gear without hopefully pushing them too far, it is feasible that in the exact wrong scenario, with perhaps the raw material buildup around the socket, with a short to ground somewhere else that's not accounted for in the CPU or board, you could potentially get into a scenario where there's a complete runaway and a house fire, or at least a small containable fire. Extremely unlikely, to emphasize that, but we've seen it before, and we've repaired user systems that have been through such scenarios. So AMD, at least, is responsible for getting insights from its partners and providing them to make sure that settings like OCP are not incompetently set, perhaps under an assumption that guidance really is just guidance, as in you should do this, not, hey, it's gonna fail if you do this the wrong way. Now it's time to move to the delidding for internal inspection. So for this, we completely preserved the motherboard and the CPU from SpeedRookie. Those are the important ones. We did not tamper with them at all beyond probing some specific pins, and we informed the FA lab which those were. So instead, we delidded the CPU from Skyfish, because that's the one that came with the Gigabyte board that still works. We confirmed it's working. It even got to BIOS F5A or whatever it is. The other one, it'll go through submersive acoustic testing, scanning electron microscopes, and more. But to delid the CPU while preserving as much damage as we could, Patrick and Vitaly flossed the 8 legs of the CPU to cut through the adhesive without affecting surface mount devices.
It's like being a dentist. It's like cutting down a tree.
Are you a dentist or a lumberjack? Changing professions. You give this guy a string of floss and he's like 3 different professions. Once done, I clamped the CPU lightly in a vise and shoved a thermocouple under the heat spreader. Using guidance from our friend and community-voted #1 bromance of the year, Dare Bauer, we used a heat gun to heat the IHS up to 160 degrees Celsius, approximately the melting point of the indium solder holding the heat spreader to the silicon. At this point, the lid fell freely, no prying required whatsoever, and we were able to delid it without any damage to the silicon itself. We took some microscope photos and videos, and we sent those to the external component failure analyst we worked with, again for 12-volt high power, and the same analyst said this, quote, "I'm seeing a cracked die from the high heat of the overstress event. Cracks emanate from the center melt site. That's not something you could have done with the delid. There's evidence of overheating, that's the darkened silicon, and of melted silicon, 1410 degrees Celsius melting point, if so. There may be a few others right of center. Fortunately, acoustic scans should clue us into whether such material discontinuities are present prior to destructive testing. Sometimes when larger scale EOS or electrical overstress occurs, a lot of different surrounding materials are pulled into the fray. I think this is what happened here too," our analyst said. "It looks like an organic material has bubbled up through the silicon melt site. The nearest organic polymer could be at the active side, where the connection from the die to the substrate occurs. That is surrounded by an organic-like solder mask or underfill. The easy solution would be to run it through EDS, or energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, to confirm." Yes, easy. That is why we're sending it to them. And the result was a ripple that cracked the silicon from the inside out. You can actually see it originating at that scorch mark. It exploded to such an extreme that it bulged the land grid array outward on the bottom of the CPU. When we scoped our own dead X3D that we killed during the course of testing, and more on that later, we saw a burn mark in nearly the same spot on the SoC. More importantly though, we noticed at least one of these CPUs had discoloration of the epoxy at the edge of the CCD and a scorch mark on the adjacent part of the substrate. Actually, in fact, VSOC feeds part of the CCD. And so there may be an issue here of a voltage differential where it is forced to exit through the explosion of the silicon. So to do our next part of analysis, we used some images from Locusa, who posts a lot of very high quality photography of dies and die shots online and does phenomenal work. And we transformed that by multiplying it as a mask on top of the damaged silicon. First, we used a clean delidded die that we also have here, and we scoped it to figure out the orientation of Locusa's image. Then we multiplied the image onto the failed I/O die. The failure within the I/O die appears to be in the middle of the GPU core complex, which actually drives the display PHY. Interestingly, we learned that the AMD IGP is one of the I/O die parts that's fed voltage via vCore, not just VSOC. We have a voltage block diagram we acquired from a contact at a motherboard manufacturer that confirms again that VSOC actually goes to part of the CCD. It's specifically this combination of the damage at the edge of the CCD with the discoloration of epoxy and the scorch mark, plus the I/O die scorch mark within the GPU complex, that led us down the path of This is probably why it exploded. And it was such an explosion that Gigabyte's power supply team would blush. We brought this next theory to a different contact, our friend Wendell from Level 1 Techs, and he had this to say. This makes sense because we know there are different voltages going into different parts of the I/O die and chiplets. The voltage differential has to go somewhere. Those are probably not completely isolated circuits. You're going to have some leakage even if they're perfectly isolated, but the reality is they probably aren't. You're going to have at least the logic circuits talking to each other between those sides. If you have a voltage differential, the differential has to be sunk to ground somewhere, somehow. In other words, it's going to go to heat. The voltage differential could go to heat that the processor experiences in a way that the engineers did not anticipate because the voltage is so much higher than stock. It'd be 50% higher if it's 1 volt versus 1.5 volts or whatever. I would go so far as to say it's not even really just the voltage by itself. If you have a really high voltage, but you only let a few electrons through, that's fine. But the SoC could be saying, no, I'm in boot up mode, I need all the current. And it makes sense why it'd be tricky to catch in QA or QC, since it's likely on an axis where a combination of silicon quality between I/O die and CCD are related. You rolled a 1 for the I/O die, for the CCD, and for the BIOS quality control? Congratulations, what do you win? Rapid unscheduled disassembly. Thanks, Wendell, for the quote. I'll use that forever. Now, the BIOS quality control point is important. This brings us to the next aspect of this, which is it's not just an AMD thing, it comes down to the board vendors as well. Prior to any of the physical testing, we noticed one big problem with the ASUS board specifically. In order to do this testing, we soldered some leads to the ASUS X670E Crosshair Hero to get more accurate readings on the SoC voltage that's actually delivered. Methodologically, this is necessary because software reporting and BIOS settings are often different from what can be measured. And a massive shout out to Elmore from Elmore Labs for helping us with some guidance on the right direction to go for this section. Elmore provided us some expert insight that helped us formulate test plans and also build custom overclocking tools, external voltage controllers, one of which we're using, and other cool enthusiast gear. You can find him on elmorelabs.com. I just want to jump back in here for a second and say this piece was awesome to work on because we collaborated with so many experts in the industry. Some could be named, some couldn't, but to all of you, thank you. It's been a lot of fun working on this. So here are our findings. Enabling Expo has the Crosshair Hero running at 1.35 volts SoC set in the BIOS. By set, what we mean is that's the number it says, but not necessarily what it reads. This is already very high by AMD's own standards though, and AMD's new statement says it shouldn't go higher than 1.3. The actual voltage delivered when probed at SoC MLCCs or on the VSoC check pads on the board is 1.4 volts. We saw one spike up to 1.41, despite the already high 1.35 volt in BIOS, and we often saw it, most commonly, sitting at about a 1.39 volt reading like you see here. That's getting dangerously high for the CPU, and at this point this is also something AMD has confirmed. But we'll come back to that. One thing is for certain, ASUS is running its SoC voltage way too high. It should be closer to 1.3 volts, or ideally 1.25 volts. And the reason to blast the SoC voltage like this largely comes down to laziness. It's the lazy way to ensure that there's wide compatibility without finer, deeper tuning to the BIOS in order to get the memory compatibility that they want. As for these numbers we're reporting, so we confirmed this on BIOS 0922, that was one just before the official X3D support. We also confirmed this behavior of the 1.4-ish voltage for SoC on 1101. That BIOS officially supported X3D, but don't let ASUS trick you because they retconned it and decided, oops, no it doesn't. But it did originally. It said it supported X3D. And then we also confirmed this behavior on 1202. That is the last BIOS that ASUS left on its site before it started hiding and burying all prior BIOSes. So they all lazily blast VSoC. Because Patrick and I were so slammed trying to get the content through the pipeline, we again reached out to Wendell and asked him for assistance checking more motherboards. He was happy to assist. Maybe a little too happy. We are gonna film the death of this CPU.
Or try to film the death of the CPU.
Here's what Wendell found. Using a mixture of leads wired to the boards like we did and hardware info, Wendell noted that the ASRock Live Mixer B650 board pulled 1.01 volts on auto, 1.20 volts for BIOS set to Expo 1, and 1.246 volts with Prime 95 loading it. He found the Phantom Gaming pulled between 1.22 and 1.24 with Expo, depending on if Prime was loading it, and he found that Gigabyte was at 1.2 to 1.22 volts. MSI was at 1.19 to 1.2 volts as well. So ASUS is a little bit of an outlier here. They're much higher than all of those, but they're still not alone. They're not the only reason these things can fail. That's where part AMD and part other board vendors comes in, because if you remember, Skyfish's system was a Gigabyte board. That one failed. The motherboard lived though. And the Gigabyte board didn't even have Expo turned on according to Skyfish. So that would be closer to the 1.0 VSOC, which makes things a little trickier. And that's probably where the FA lab will come in a few weeks. So we think it's more than VSOC. And if you look at AMD's statement, they did talk about tuning other voltages, including VSOC, but we'll come back to that. And we're also aware of at least one BioStar board that was at or in excess of 1.4 volts SOC as well. But one important note here for Expo. Expo itself, think of it again as sort of an XMP, it has nothing to do within the profiles about VSOC. Expo does not contain a number for the SoC or the system on chip voltage. Applying Expo shouldn't necessarily state that you are also applying a dangerously high voltage. That's on the motherboard vendors. That is ASUS's decision to do that. So Expo, although it is a potential trigger if configured incorrectly by the motherboard vendor, itself is not the cause for this. Just want to make that really clear, because Expo is pretty cool. It has a lot of really high quality tuning and timings built into it for the different kits, and that's what's making AMD as competitive as it is right now, because without it, they're kind of weak. Regardless, SoC voltages of 1.4 are clearly not necessary. In the week or so of testing that we ran on this, we found a whole host of other bugs, some related to this, some not, but there were a lot of them, and we can't fit them all in this video. We tried, it added 15 minutes. We're gonna run a follow-up piece with some more information on that, some ranting about how this was handled very poorly in a lot of cases by everybody, AMD and motherboard vendors, especially ASUS though. But that's a separate thing. So the main issues, the severe ones from this piece, were proc hot, VSOC problems of various types, and OCP being basically improperly executed. To quickly recap some of the other ones we found, because we've never had to dig this hard into AMD's AM5 platform before, here's the short version. On some platforms, we noticed the X3D CPUs were shutting down at inappropriately high temperatures for over temperature. So on ASRock, Gigabyte, and MSI, various boards, we observed in combination with Wendell a 116-degree thermal trip point. But on ASUS, for the board we tested, it was 106. It's supposed to be 106 for X3D and 116 for non-X3D. So this got royally screwed up by at least 3 board partners, which to us means AMD is at fault for not communicating it properly and offering adequate support to those partners. On Gigabyte F5A, we observed a potentially fatal bug where it was sometimes not possible to reset VSOC to auto or defaults, and on ASUS we noted another bug where loading Expo via the AMD overclocking menu provided by the AMD Gigabyte binary rather than the ASUS menu would load the correct SoC voltage. So it'd often be 1.2 or 1.25, while ASUS's menu was loading it at 1.35 for the BIOSes we were testing, except for those newest patches that came out. Now, unfortunately, ASUS has another bug, or AMD does, it's in their menu after all, where it doesn't load the correct VDDIO voltage using this menu. That results in blue screens and crashes because it's the wrong VDDIO. Honestly, this platform is just a complete mess, and we didn't realize that going into the initial reviews because we followed our standard reviews process and everything works fine for the purposes of testing other than whatever we might have noted in those reviews. But this issue necessitated a much deeper look, exploring a lot more settings, a lot more combinations of hardware, and it just made it look really much messier than the standard approach does. So that's not good for AM5. And there were more bugs that, again, we're not even talking about here because they're just not related enough. For the rest, here's the quick and final rundown for now. This, as always, is not fully and definitively conclusive because it's an extremely complex issue. It's really hard to replicate this problem. It took us the entire time to get the catastrophic failure to happen. So that should reduce your concern significantly. We had to actively try to find out how to make this happen. Doesn't mean it won't accidentally happen, probably a much higher likelihood, honestly, than trying, but the point is it's not easy. And so that should temper sort of the concern about how likely is this to happen to you. We had a limited sample size, of course, and we also were working off of changing information. Now, the good news here is we had some extremely conclusive results. So we're out of hypothesis territory and into just actually proven fact with some of these problems. The OCP issue, that was proven fact. The theory about a sort of voltage differential causing an escape path that is undesirable, that's in theory territory. Here's the bulleted recap. AMD and its partners are actively rolling out BIOSes to address this. Most address it by locking down the VSOC. The rollout has been complete chaos. ASUS, for example, is clearly incapable of getting the CPU names right. Gigabyte doesn't get out unscathed either. They have their own rollout issues. AMD is offering replacements for CPUs killed in this manner. That's even if Expo was on. We asked AMD and we confirmed that at least the US will have free shipping both directions if one of your CPUs dies. Motherboard vendors may not be so kind. It's to be determined. Next question of, is this resolved? We believe the SoC clampdown is inadequate as a blanket fix. It's a quick fix, and it resolves a lot of the concerns of longevity and slowly damaging the processor over time. And remember, that's sort of what you get with typing in a higher VSOC is you simulate that aging much faster. But in a real use case, running at 1.4 for months or a year on end or whatever, you're going to lose some kind of ability over time, and maybe it results in a failure. Maybe it doesn't. It depends on the chip quality. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is you should stop running at that voltage, because there's no reason to. Maybe there's some memory stability problems, but you could probably bring it down to a more reasonable 1.3 or something. The ASUS OCP problem needs to be resolved separately. The Gigabyte problem, where it just refuses to listen to user input and won't zero out and reset to auto the SoC voltage on some BIOSes, that's another problem too. And right now, as an end user wondering if this affects you, here's the answer. If you have X3D especially, but really any of them, you should update BIOS. You should check VSOC as a baseline on hardware info. There's a free version. This number isn't perfect, but it's a good start. And some boards have embedded controllers that give you even more accurate information that's more useful. If VSOC is greater than 1.3 when you're looking at this, lower it manually. You should check under load and idle. Remember that set point VSOC can often be different from actualized, but typically not as much as that 50 millivolt deviation we saw earlier. Also, X3D is more fragile. So this has been a lot of fun. It's been really exciting to work on this. It's a different process from the standard reviews. There's just sort of a lot of mental puzzling with it, trying to figure it out. Video's long enough though, and at this point, just the reminder that there are always limitations to testing. We've worked very hard to close all those loops that we can. There are still, of course, limitations, and that's why we're going to have follow-ups. But even then, if some new information pops up, please make sure we see it. You can tweet it at us or something. And we feel pretty good about the results that we found. But some of our attempts at explanation, of course, rely on assumptions. So that's the one thing we want to make sure everyone keeps in mind, just full transparency. And we tested ASUS the most heavily since it was the clearest offender, but that doesn't mean other motherboards can't also have been problematic. And ultimately updating the BIOS, quickly checking VSOC, that should be enough to just put it out of your mind once you do that, because any other issues are probably out of your control anyway and just pending more updates. And there's no point being anxious about something that you have absolutely no control over anyway. So we're doing more testing. We'll keep you all updated. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to grab this shirt to help us out directly and support our efforts. This is for 15 years in business now. We've been doing it a while, and we're looking forward to another 15. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.